Okay. All right. Well, look, thank you everybody for joining us today for our webinar on developing successful solar projects. It's great to see so many people taking interest in this topic and in Flow Power's webinar series in general. I think we had something near 500 people registering for this session today. So yeah, just fantastic to see how many people are tuning in. So before we get started, I'm just going to talk through some small housekeeping things. Essentially, the presentation is going to go for around 30 minutes. We'll try to leave 15 minutes at the end for some questions. And you should see a question box on the other end of your screen. So as we go through, feel free to put questions into that. We'll jump onto questions as we go if we see the opportunity, but otherwise we'll try to get through them at the end. And lastly, there's going to be a recording of the webinar sent out after the session, and it'll also be published on our website if you'd like to revisit in the future. Okay, so let me introduce everybody on the call today. Joining me today, I have Sarah Cork from the investments team and Tom Harrison, our utility project manager. G'day, guys.
Hey, Byron.
Hey, Byron. Hey, Sarah. Hey, everybody.
I feel like
Thanks
you guys
for
have
having
done
us today.
work from home backdrops there.
Yeah.
Yes, you have a view into our house.
Yeah, I can actually see the ukulele, Tom.
Yeah, it's got the ukulele behind me. Yeah, it feels, I don't know, we've been working from home since about mid-March now. It feels like the norm. My chair's got its grooves in it. Yeah.
Yeah, sadly, my wall's got the black marks to prove how much I've been swinging around. So.
I like your global map in the background, Byron. You can plan your adventure for 2022.
It does have travel plans on it, actually. Too bad it's from I think it's about 100 years out of date, but apart from that, it's useful. So guys, I thought we might just start with each of you telling everybody a little bit about what you do at Flow Power. Tom, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. So I work across a couple of teams at Flow Power. I work pretty closely with Sarah and Steve on the new projects in the investments team on performing due diligence on acquisitions and also working on the developments of new sort of greenfield projects for Flow. And then when I have spare time, we also do some consulting work for some of Flow's large customers across some of the engineering services projects.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Cork. I work in the investments team in Flow Power. We spend a lot of time working together with engineering on acquiring and then developing generation assets, but also we're the relationship between the renewable generation projects, securing PPAs, and then the on-flow of that to our customers through a product we call a virtual generation agreement, but it is essentially a corporate PPA.
Okay, and I see here that you're licensed to drive trucks in your spare time, Sarah.
Yes, that very specifically for horses, as you can see. I'm a bit of a horse fan, so yeah, I had to get my heavy rigid truck driver's license to transport them. So it's a bit of fun.
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
And tell us a little bit about your boat, Byron.
Okay, well, the funnest fact I can think of is my old red boat called Havana Club. It's named Havana Club as a real nod to the Cuban look, and by that I mean it's basically falling apart, but it is great to have a good day out of it. So I'll start with a quick introduction of Flow Power because this is probably one of the key questions we see from these webinars. So for those who aren't familiar with Flow Power, I guess the way we look at it is we're like an energy management company that also has a retail license. Our goal is to really work with large-scale energy users and C&I customers to give them full access to the benefits of the electricity market, and in doing so, help drive the market towards a low-carbon future. So we do this through helping customers manage and procure energy in the most efficient way possible, including on-site generation and storage, offtakes from large and small scale projects, as Sarah mentioned. And that's kind of what we're going to be exploring today. Okay, so this is the first webinar we've done specifically on solar. So today we're going to be taking a very broad look, almost an introductory look at what we see as the key ingredients to developing successful solar projects or developing them specifically. And we're going to be focusing on projects that are for energy users. So we're talking about behind the meter generation projects and also small scale front of meter solar farms. So for those of you who don't know what the difference is between small scale, front of meter and behind the meter is, we'll get into that really quickly. But I think this is probably going to be the start of a few topics or webinars on this topic. So today we'll look quickly on the market context, where we are with solar. We'll look at some of the kind of what we see as the secrets to success or some key considerations around project planning and development, and then we'll end on some example projects. Okay, Sarah, did you have
just before we
quiz?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, just before we get into the swing of things, we thought we'd like to hear from the audience a little bit about where you are in terms of considering developing a solar project and who out there is or isn't and what your timeframes are. So essentially we'll have a couple of minutes here while everyone answers the question, and then we get a bit of an idea as to, I guess, where you are in the process and how we can frame that into our conversation today. We can see here the majority are looking at a project within the next 3 to 6 months. So very exciting times ahead.
Okay, yeah, that's great to see.
That's fantastic.
Is that 60-something% in the next 0 to 2 years? That's pretty good.
Okay, well, look, thanks everybody for helping set the scene on where people are up to with their solar projects. So we'll just talk quickly about the market context. And what we like to touch on is just a brief history of the Australian solar market and the key drivers behind the solar boom. So I like this chart that the guys have put together on this slide. Basically shows the early beginnings of the rooftop solar days in 2001 with the establishment of the renewable energy target, and some of those incredible feed-in tariffs that we all wish we saw nowadays of 60 cents or more for those early projects. 2010 marked what was a real gold rush, I guess, or gold rush era in rooftop solar, where there was kind of a confluence of solar prices actually becoming quite cheap, but also the government incentives being quite lucrative. And that was a real boom for residential solar before those incentives ended, I think, around year 2011, 2012. That brought us into the era of the first utility scale projects, which was, I guess, a very exciting time in Australia. Those projects were supported by the kind of early PPA movers like the ACT government. But these were projects, I think, 20, 50 megawatt projects like Royalla, Broken Hill, Moree. Tom, you know a few of those firsthand?
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? You think back to sort of, PPA prices at $186 or whatever it was for some of those ACT auctions. You think, and then there was a bit of a drop down. I think, what did it hit, about sort of 70, 80 bucks, and then a megawatt hour, and then and now it's continuing to fall. Yep,
and the initial module power classes of 200 or so watts versus nowadays where we're starting to see the 500 watt barrier cracked.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, isn't it? Yeah, I was trying to think after you mentioned it the other day that I think Moree was 295 watts. modules, and now we just saw some of the big manufacturers coming out with, 525, 530 watt modules at the end of this year, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah,
And is it the new technology that's pushing the PPA prices down, you think? Is that the sole reason?
Oh, look, it's absolutely helping. That's for sure. I think one of the, I actually just written on that slide there. So yeah, solar continues to be basically the cheapest form of new generation. I think Bloomberg had some numbers out last month or early this month saying that still year on year 9% decline in LCOE for large scale solar, and in Australia prices around in the 40s per megawatt hour for large scale solar projects. So yeah, continuing to I guess decline incredibly, even with the tailing off of LGC prices and other things like that. And I think one of the nice little facts there at the end of that chart is that Australia is deploying renewables 10 times faster than the global average, which is pretty cool. And I think probably still 4 or 5 times faster than the developed world, or Western world.
Sure. And that 14 gigawatt number is just huge, isn't it? We were talking about how that was part of a, total NEM demand still around, 45 gigs. And you were saying, so some of that is obviously rooftop stuff that gets buried in that demand number, but that's just getting up towards, what is that, 30% of NEM demand already, which is pretty impressive.
So what's driving this? I think everybody on the call here has a good feel for why people are choosing solar, but number one is really economics, and being Australia still has some of the highest power prices in the world, and the highest network tariffs in the world, among the highest, and so solar still makes great economic sense. Solar is a readily accessible and a well accepted generation technology now. Maybe that depends a little bit on what newspaper you read, but I think that's pretty well accepted. And there's also a growing trend towards sustainability in the market, which is fantastic to see. So what's next? That's the big question. It could be great to get your guys' thoughts here, Sarah and Tom, but I think what we're probably thinking is to see continued strong growth in rooftop PV. I don't think there's anyone saying that's going to come to an end anytime soon. And then a divergence towards mega scale and sub 5 megawatt utility scale projects. So that's quite interesting. And I think what's driving that is really the economics of very large scale projects being able to hit those low LCOE numbers versus where we see forward prices for daytime energy. That requires mega scale projects to become more and more competitive. But then also at the same time, you've got sub 5 megawatt utility scale projects that are really emerging as a solution to the many network issues that are seen across Australia, and a way to get past those.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and that's become more and more important recently. I think with the well-documented sort of commissioning issues and just the challenges with getting a project that's above 5 megawatts registered, so yeah, I think it seems that there's a bit of a niche there on that, keeping your project below 5 megawatts AC to really streamline that network connection process. And I think when you're looking at developing a project as well, I think the costs of running a set of connection studies and then getting that through your network and through AEMO and getting registered, that that sort of costs and the time and the risk associated with that process now sort of pushes. I suspect we're going to see less and less sort of 10 megawatt projects now. It'll move to sub 5 or the big stuff, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to close out this slide, look, I think we are seeing some delays in the market for large scale projects due to coronavirus and access to debt markets. But at the same time, for smaller scale behind the meter projects, the government has put forward some stimulus incentives there for new business investments, which is helping to kind of keep that market, keep those projects moving during these times. So Tom, I wanted to pass over to you for this one to talk through our slides on, how do we really go about project planning and project development?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Byron. And I think, as we said, this is a really broad topic. So when I start talking about this now, in front of mind is the smaller scale projects, tailored projects. But a lot of these things will be relevant to if you're working on a utility scale or a really, a 100 megawatt project as well. But I guess the first one is to understand what your drivers are for the project. Obviously there's economic drivers, but also sustainability targets, and just making that really clear up front about what you're trying to achieve. And I think internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders are really important. And I recommend reaching out to your local distribution network and your consent authority, be it your local regional council or probably your local regional council in regards to your project as early as possible, and all of the stakeholders, and you really need to bring everybody along on the development cycle. And then I'd say look at your energy requirements first. Don't start with I want the biggest possible project. Look at your energy requirements, your historical demand, what's happening into the future with your business, and then use that to really develop the start to develop your project. And then understand the limitations and constraints in your business. How are you planning on funding this project? What are your capital constraints? What are your physical constraints? Even as simple as when you're commissioning the project, if it's a behind the meter project, timing that with potential shutdowns or interruptions to business as usual can be things to put to front of mind when you start these projects. Yeah. So I'd say if you're starting from scratch, I would recommend starting with your interval data as an energy user. So if you can get that, ideally at an hourly or more granular level than that, you can usually, if you don't have access to that already through your site SCADA or whatever you have system set up, I'd speak to your retailer or meter data authority on that one. Understanding your electricity contract and its value. So what are you paying for energy? What is the value of exports under your current contract? Are you allowed to under your current contract? Are you able to realize value from exports? Can be something really important at the start, and then you really want to spend some time running those numbers in Excel or find someone that can help you with that. And that's really where I start, or when we start looking at particularly behind the meter projects. That's really important. And then also in terms of a toolbox, I'd say really important here is setting up a project financial model, and then always circling back to that financial model. You can start with really high level assumptions, and look, there are lots of people out there that can help you set up a project financial model, but without sort of setting your hurdle rate or your return rates or whatever outcomes you're trying to achieve in your model, and then even starting with really high level assumptions and then continuing to refine those, and every time you come up against a development hurdle or updates to system designs or costs or all sorts of operational costs, and it's important to run those back through the model to understand where your project is tracking, and then you'll start to understand sensitivities as well, I think, about really what affects the returns in your model and how your project's shaping up. For the larger projects, something like Google Maps can be a really helpful tool, and it's got some useful features in that. Or obviously, if you have someone in your organization that has GIS or CAD skills, or you want to engage somebody to help you with that, that can be really useful. And also running independent yield assessments if you can, or engaging somebody to help you with that is important. And then if you're really starting from scratch, there are some knowledge sharing reports out there from ARENA that can be really helpful as well.
Really and Tom, why would a customer choose front of meter or behind the meter? What would be the drivers behind that decision?
Sure, yeah. Look, I'll start with behind the meter. So behind the meter, typically the energy from your project for behind the meter, it'll be more valuable to you because you're offsetting your actual consumption, plus there might be benefits in demand charges or other costs for energy for you. So look, you know, you might find a behind the meter project the returns are better, but you've got to be a little bit lucky there in that you're working with what you've got. So if you're lucky enough to have a facility with some room next door or a rooftop of a suitable size, or spare land on your facility, then and do scrutinize it as well. But that's sort of, you've got to work with what you've got there, but you can be really lucky. And if you have a site that's suitable for behind the meter, then that can be really is great. But front of the meter projects, I guess the benefit, what we're calling front of the meter, you can put this project anywhere, which is great. So you can be a bit more discerning on your site selection process. But there will be, I guess, complexities, and maybe you can get a retailer to help you here, but linking this back to your facility or your fleets. Typically, you might find if you're developing a behind the meter project, it might be a bit more of a brownfield development where you're putting it adjacent to your facility. But if you're starting with a greenfield development, that you may find that there are some additional development hurdles as well. But again, that can circle back to your site selection process, which I think we might get into a little bit better on the next slide.
Okay, I think just before we move on from that one, I think, Tom, you raised a really good point on the financial model and that being key to the project. I think it sounds like something that's a kind of a boring part of solar project development, you know, getting an Excel sheet together, but I think it's really incredibly important for making those decisions, and also just for getting to think long term in terms of how these projects play out over the, you know, the forward years. That's just such a great point. I think even the best and the most sophisticated developers in the Australian market have probably all had projects where they've missed something in that model, and that's, you know, materially changed the outcome at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And do keep circling back. I mean, we set up a financial model for every project right at the start, and it's okay to start with those high level assumptions. But I know, Sarah, as well, you probably, like, it's important to put in all of the operational costs and all of everything from insurances and all sorts of asset management costs and everything in the model, so that you are really looking at the actual performance of your project financially, which is really key.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think another one, and it's probably a good segue to this slide on misconceptions, but another really common misconception we see in modeling solar farm project returns is that power prices are really going up exponentially year on year, and that, you know, when you're looking at solar returns from, be it a small rooftop system for your home or a large project, we see a lot of really aggressive assumptions in terms of where forward prices are expected to be. And that really does differ significantly from what the kind of independent experts are forecasting for the market. So that's another one to get right. Don't just assume.
We're lucky in that we have access to forecasts and all sorts of things, but I think that's important to understand. The value and what the spot price is forecast to do over the futures. Because that, particularly in the back end of your model, if you've got a 30-year financial model, then that back end can be really, really important as well. I think I'm not sure what you think, Byron, but I think the days of endlessly increasing power prices are probably behind us.
Yeah, I think so. And Sarah, you work with this day to day. What's your view on forward price curves for daytime solar?
I guess it depends at the moment based on which state, you know, and the penetration of solar, but certainly as we go forward and see more solar in the market, I imagine we're going to see a bit of that duck curve emerge.
Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, look, we probably better keep moving in terms of getting through these slides. Tom, did you want to pick out one or two of these, and then we'll move on to the next?
Yeah, sure. You'll often hear this one that someone will have some land that's spare, and they see some power lines going on the side of the road, and they think automatically it's a solar farm. So look, you do need to be a bit scrupulous. You know, not all power lines are created equal. Not all paddocks are created equal. And so I think that you know, that can be a really common misconception about that one. I don't know if you want to talk about I'm a tenant, I can't have solar, Byron. You hear that one a lot as well?
We do, yeah, we do hear that one a lot. I think to keep this response quick, I think, look, there are proprietary products that are readily accessible in the market that essentially provide the interbilling between tenants and landlords. So if you do have a landlord that you'd like to see invest in solar, but they basically wouldn't be interested in spending the money because they don't see the return, there is a way to make that work, which should benefit both parties. For us, it's easy. We have a retail license, but even those without it, there's plenty of systems available.
Yeah, so I wanted to just take a minute to just touch on technology. I guess the first part would be don't rush in. Like I said, start with your financial model, start with your interval data for your energy, and then work from there. You know, seek independent advice on your technology choices. Don't just speak to suppliers or contractors necessarily. Typically with your mounting system, obviously you're usually working with a single axis or a fixed tilt system, and they'll have corresponding yield and shape implications, which will circle back into your model. Hopefully your model's sophisticated enough. And I think that shape thing against your energy profile is really important as well. You may find that the energy at certain times of the day is worth more to you, or you're able to offset more of your load, or achieves your outcomes better. So I think shape is an important thing to keep in your mind. But just typically, you know, obviously single axis tracking, you get a higher specific yield. You know, you might in New South Wales, you might be looking at 1900, you know, kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak, whereas with a fixed tilt, you're probably looking around 1600. So you know, you can get a higher yield per installed kilowatt, but with a fixed tilt, you can probably install more kilowatts. So I'd really focus on shape on that one and yield rather than installed megawatts in your model. Inverters, really quickly, you know, pick a manufacturer with a track record in Australia. Obviously, especially for the bigger projects, commissioning and performance are key risks here. And for a smaller project, your inverter can be if not a single point of failure, then a large point of failure. So go with a good, you know, an inverter with, I don't want to name names here, but go with a inverter manufacturer that's got projects online in Australia. That'll also help you with the networks as well. And then the last one with modules is don't rush in with modules. You see power classes changing almost on a monthly basis. Prices are constantly coming down, as we mentioned. 530 watts is the highest power class I've heard of this week, and you know, we're seeing prices below 21 US cents a watt, which is really cheap. I guess that depends on how big your project is and how big your order is and your relationship with that supplier. But back onto development, I guess planning and permitting is one of the key work streams. So you really need to know what permits you need and what studies to do. I suggest really go meet your local council. Will do a pre-lodgement meeting, which essentially will you'll sit down with them. They'll look at your site location and raise any flags that they want to see addressed in the development process. And if there are question marks, engage with your specialists early. Get out if there are potential flora or fauna issues on site, or there are certain constraint layers that have been raised, then get out there and assess those early on. And you really want to try and avoid too many referral agencies. Commonwealth issues like you know, can really become a big problem. So you really want to get on the front foot with that. And I do reckon a pre-lodgement meeting with a council is a really good way to start that. Similarly with network connections, talk to your local network straight away. Submit a preliminary connection inquiry early. Most networks will do it for free or really a nominal fee for the initial inquiry, and that'll give you a high level yes or no, usually on the feasibility of connection. And it's often not just about thermal capacity in the network. It can be about perceived voltage issues or system strength or all sorts of things. So you really, unless you're really sophisticated, you're probably not going to be able to work that out without talking directly to your network straight away. And they'll you know, tell you if you can export, what constraints you need to operate under, and that can have big implications for your effective yield in your model, and also the cost of your connection and your requirements for additional, you know, reactive plant or anything like that that the network's going to require you to install, and that needs to be run through your model early, because those are big sunk costs that have to be paid for at the start of the project. And and you really want to make sure that they're well understood early. And another good one to think about, without running through everything, is how you're structuring your project and how you're funding it. What long-term agreements you need to have in place, how you need to approach certain risks will depend on your financing and structure of the project. So it's important to understand that upfront, what you need to do to satisfy the requirements of that approach. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Another important consideration is obviously how that solar generation then feeds into your retail agreement. So it's important to understand, as we were discussing before, your interval data and usage and what shape that is, and whether you need a VGA of wind or additional solar to complement that shape, and whether your retailer has the ability to sleeve your on-site PPA into an agreement, and also understanding additional sustainability goals and whether you need some LGCs to complement your current solar generation, and basically a holistic solution that your energy retailer can help to provide you.
Yeah, Sarah, just as we go through, I've seen some. Thank you everybody for sitting through all these questions, by the way. One that's just jumped out at me here. Explain the term sleeving. Would you mind doing that in a bit of detail for those on the call?
So essentially, sleeving is where we offset the generation against the load or the usage and provide it into one retail agreement. So the I guess the generation is netted off their total consumption for the month.
And I think this is a really important slide here about thinking through how your retailer, or how you can integrate with your retailer in delivering some of these projects. So there's a lot of kind of little tricks that people tend to get caught out with when they're doing behind the meter projects. Some retail agreements don't let you reduce your load by a certain amount, or there's certain repricing or penalties that can be applied if you essentially reduce consumption too much. And then there's also what feed-in tariff you might be getting from the retailer for the energy we're exporting back into the grid. So, we see feed-in tariffs provided across the market change year on year. So if you're putting together a medium to long-term investment case based on an element of power or price of power getting fed back into the grid, you just have to be cognizant that your next retail agreement could have a different number in it, and you need to be able to work with your retailer on what that could be.
Yeah, I think you're right, Byron, and I think that the message is engage with your retailer as early as possible, and let them help you structure how this will work in with your retail agreement. Okay, next we're going to go on to... There are, and we will get to them in a moment. We've just got a quick project example that we're going to run through, bringing together an integrated solution. We've got an agricultural organisation. They have multiple sites with different behind-the-meter potential and off-site renewables with a VGA. Essentially, their aim is to meet their organisational and energy sustainability goals, and the opportunity is to integrate a solution allowing an optimization across on-site and off-site project mix. So I'm going to ask Byron to step through a little bit of the process of how the customer would engage in this process.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I'll do it quickly because I'm cognizant we've got some great questions here, and I'll speed through this so we can get on to some. But for this particular customer, we're following a similar process to what Tom established. We're establishing those project goals. Sustainability here was a big one. Working out the energy demands, the constraints on site for what they had. So in this instance, we're talking about multiple sites, and also the key stakeholders within the organisation and externally. Then there's this kind of process of the site screening, investigation, and feasibility. That's this is where you start to kind of develop your financial model. You're developing concept options. So maybe for this, we're looking at a couple of different options, some that have more behind the meter generation, some that have less and look to external offsite projects that have a lower generation cost because they're larger. And then ultimately putting that into a business case for what this looks like as an integrated solution. Finally, we go through the process of engaging with construction and finance partners. Retailer engagement's obviously really important, and this one, I guess it's from the beginning. And then looking to actually apply that multiple site retail solution. So I'll just take you through a couple of slides which kind of illustrate this quite quickly. This is what we're talking about. So this is an integrated multiple site solution. Here we're looking at an asset portfolio that's just simplified here to looking at 3 sites that are owned by the company. So that's one site at the top basically is able to have behind the meter solar, which is great. The next site doesn't have demand, but it is a site that can be used for solar. And then the third one is essentially a site where there was no opportunity to fit solar either on the roof because of the structurally it wasn't possible, or adjacent as a ground mounted system. So as an integrated solution, what we're talking about is a concept called virtual net metering, in which the generation from one site essentially can be shared with the others by a retailer. You still have the classic pros and cons with front of the meter versus behind the meter. So the behind the meter will save you on your network charges, whereas the front of the meter options, you've probably got a better pick of the sites, and you'll probably be able to get a lower cost generation for what you deploy on those sites. Then just looking outside the asset portfolio box, we can see here where essentially the customer gets the balance of their energy, and that's either coming from the electricity market, or in this instance, we're looking at an offsite wind project to meet the demands that weren't provided with on-site solar. So that's a really quick run through. We'll probably get into this on another seminar series, I feel, but here's how we can illustrate it quickly. And for those people who care to download this later can have a look in more detail. The black line is the demand across the day for all the aggregated sites. You start with the yellow bars at the bottom. So that's looking at what you can do on site for behind the meter. And the yellow bars essentially will offset your on-site consumption. The little orange tips are essentially what's exported during the day. We apply to that the red dotted line, which is your front of meter solar farm solutions, and the dotted blue line, which is a large scale wind project. All up, that gives you the green line against the black line, which is your total renewables. And in this instance, the target was reaching that 100% renewables mark on an annual basis. This is an illustration of how it comes together. So just being cognizant on time, I'll kind of wrap that up. I guess just as a message before we move on to the questions is that, look, there's so many great consultants that are out in the market that can help with your projects. For those of you on the call who feel like they need help, even if it's just advice or pointing in the right direction, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're very happy to help guide and help get more renewable projects into the market. Okay, so some questions.
I found quite an interesting question here that I thought might be a good conversation starter.
Yep.
With more frequent negative spot price events in the NEM, are battery storage systems likely to become an essential feature of new solar project developments?
Yeah, it's a good
I thought
question.
this was interesting, obviously, because we're seeing a lot of batteries emerging, and love to hear your thoughts, Tom.
Sure, I can go first. Yeah, look, negative pricing is one issue, and like you said, the sort of lower dispatch weighted pricing you see with solar projects is another. And I guess that sort of diurnal arbitrage issue as well are all factors that yeah, batteries seem like a good solution for. And they all sort of go into the revenue models for batteries. And look, I think that's really true. What do you see, Byron, in terms of where that tipping? I feel like there needs to be a tipping point coming up with batteries. At the moment, it seems like it's on the horizon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think if there's any market in the world that's going to be the first to look at large-scale storage uptake, Australia would hopefully be one of them. I think, you know, at present, we see there are always challenges in getting business cases to stack up for battery storage systems, but every day it's getting closer and closer. And there's also some great government funding initiatives that's helped current batteries get into the market. And there's a couple of programs that are around at the moment to help kind of the next wave in. So I think it'll probably be something similar to solar, where it'll be started with the help from government incentives, but we'll soon find that it becomes, as the question says, an essential feature in the future electricity market.
Yeah, sure. I just a really quick one. I've seen a few questions about the impacts of COVID on these sort of projects, and I just really quickly, I think what we've seen is there was a bit of a scare at first, but I think in terms of procurement, that all seems to be back on track. So I don't really, apart from maybe you touched on, maybe there's some financing question marks more or impacts, Byron, but generally from ability to execute a project and get your modules or your plant into Australia, it seems like those supply chains are back on track at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I think the supply side is kind of overtaken the demand side now for a lot of these manufacturers, and they're kind of what used to be or were expecting to be longer lead times have actually kind of reduced far more quickly than people had anticipated.
Yeah, we've seen a move towards the use of much more local as subcontractors and contractors to assist when the borders are closed as well.
Yep. That's a good point as well. Also, there's just a question about MLF risk, and I guess on this one, just really quickly as well, if you're developing a sub 5 megawatt project, you get assigned the nearest node MLF for loads. So that one, you know, that's good to know. For greater than 5 megawatt projects, you will get assigned a project specific MLF, and look, yeah, you can you know, you can take forecasts, and then that's a bit of a balancing act with MLF. Typically, as a rule of thumb, if you stick your project near some loads, that's the best sort of way to hedge that risk. But it's one of the big inputs in your financial model that you need to get comfortable with.
Yeah, I've got a good one here that I like, and that's what are the pros and cons versus buying land and leasing land for your solar project. This is, you could probably talk for a very long time on this question, but I think it's a good one. Essentially, you know, there's no right answer here. So we see developers and asset owners going either way, you know, almost on a 50-50 basis. I think some of it, and it all comes down to, or a lot of it comes down to the financial model that Tom talked about. Are you getting a better price for the lease as you would the purchase, and how does that look in the model? But I guess to provide some more detail, you know, some of the pros are if you're leasing the land, that's less upfront cost that goes into the model and your financing process. So that allows you to kind of gear at effectively a higher leverage ratio or a higher amount of debt coming into the process for the projects that you would otherwise. So that's the lease. Versus if you purchase the land, I think you've basically got complete control of that land. For every project, there's always things that pop up along the way and permissions that you'll need to ask from the landowner. And often landowners are really helpful and excited to have the project there, but it is one less thing to worry about, I guess, if you do own the land.
Sure.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question. Sarah, do you want to take a pick?
I'm just scrolling through.
I've got an interesting one here, and it's a kind of question, also a comment. It's talking about project finance will not touch a project, generally speaking, without a PPA. PPAs don't come to form, I guess, until after you get the connection agreement. So for a 5 megawatt project, that means about 250 to 350,000 minimum risk. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think basically the answer is yes. Is that as a developer, you are embarking on putting or developing a project. You are potentially putting down development costs at risk. Depending on your NEM region, you might be able to get all your project approvals away for maybe 100,000 versus up to 350,000, which is listed here. But I think that connection agreement, it shows that it is a crucial part of the process, and you certainly need to de-risk that early on in your development process through discussions with the DNSP, as Tom mentioned, and basically making sure that you don't get surprised at the end. But I think even the most sophisticated developers get that unwelcome news, so it's almost part of the process.
Sure. One of the real development challenges, I think, that's just inherent in this is that you've got multiple work streams that need to sort of come together at the same time in this perfect crescendo of the project starting. So look, I don't think there's a silver bullet on timing, but yeah, like we said, if you start to be pragmatic and approach all the risks and that's the best you can do, really. I think. There are important distinctions between different not all distribution networks are created equal, not all consent authorities are created equal. So understanding the steps and the processes for your particular project is really helpful. So understanding what the requirements are across, and that really can be really locationally specific as well.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, guys. Well, look, I think we're a few minutes over time, but we're pretty close. So it's probably the right time to wrap it up. Look, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, if you do have queries or questions about your project and would like a little bit of advice, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We want to see more of these projects get up. But I'd also like to thank Sarah and Tom for joining me on this webinar, and for everybody for staying tuned.
Great. Thanks, Byron. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah,
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Stay safe.
Yeah.